Welcome to Life After Philosophy, where I interview former students about philosophy's effect on their lives. I'm Christopher Annandale. Welcome to Life After Philosophy. My guest today is Stephen McGinley. He is currently a lecturer in the philosophy department at Mount St. Mary's University, my colleague there. He is also a farmer at Good Soil Farm of Emmitsburg, Maryland. He is the father of 5 children and a good friend of mine. He completed his bachelor's degree in 2010 at Mount St. Mary's University with a major in economics and, as I understand it, an undeclared philosophy minor. He subsequently studied at the John Paul II Institute for Studies on Marriage and Family, and in 2012 graduated with a master's degree in theological studies. Stephen, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Chris. It's wonderful to be here.
Now, I mentioned that you lecture in philosophy, and you've been my colleague here in the department for the past 7 or 8 years?
Yeah, 2016 I taught at Frederick. 2017 in the fall, taught symposium, and then 2018 was hired to teach philosophy.
So the past 6 to 8 years,
that's right.
You've been my colleague here in the philosophy department in Bradley Hall,
Yep.
Which is fantastic. You're a fantastic colleague, and I've been eager to interview you since early in this show. But I mentioned your sort of double role here is that you teach philosophy and you're a farmer.
That's right.
Locally here, and I refer to you, in my house we refer to you always and only as Farmer McGinley. You run a community-supported agriculture program in the summers, spring, summer, and early fall that we've subscribed to the past couple of years. So I'd invite you just to share something of your experience and the value of philosophy in your life the past 14 years since you didn't quite complete a philosophy minor.
That's right.
And its role in your identity both as a teacher and as a farmer. Please go ahead.
Yeah, so when I was at the Mount, and I took, I think by my count, about 6 or 7 philosophy courses. I was primarily interested in thinking about, in ancient and metaphysics, I was introduced to, let's say, like conceptions of reality, right?
Yes.
And then their implications for, with more reflection than I was thinking about the implications of those conceptions on reality, on human practices and human action and how we farm. And it dovetailed, at the same time I was taking, metaphysics and Islamic with Mike Miller and Josh Hochschild. I was taking the Gospel of Mark with McCarthy and Donahue.
Wow.
And so what I realized a couple things. One, that, things have a nature of which we're not the author.
Right.
And then 2, there are a lot of parables that Christ uses that are agricultural that I don't have any practical experiential knowledge of. And that it became a sort of intellectual exercise at guessing what the practical, like, embodied way of living out those tasks how that would influence, like, the actual parable or what Christ is getting at. So, like, here's an example that I share with, I was just reflecting on this today, and I've thought about it many times, but the parable of the sower and the seed, right?
Yeah.
And some falls on the path, it's consumed by Satan, yeah. Some falls on the rocky ground, and some falls among thorns, and then some falls on good soil. And you on a simplistic reading, you think, okay, well, there's like at least 4 types of places that it can fall. Yeah, sure. The first thought, though, is, why is the sower so generous with the sowing?
Yeah.
Right? Like, No one in early Palestine, no farmer wastes seed throwing it onto on a path. That's an absolute waste of seed, and seed is precious.
Mm-hmm.
You wouldn't do that. You also wouldn't throw it on rocky ground, like ground that you know is not fit for production. You wouldn't throw it there, and you wouldn't throw it among the thorns.
Yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't thought of this.
Right? So a farmer, talking to an agrarian society, they would know, now wait a second, if we're going to act according to the nature of things, because that's how every classical sort of civilization acted that wanted to survive past 4 generations, you would be attentive to what you're doing and what the potentialities are of that place and that soil. And so the first sort of lesson is the sower is super abundantly generous. Mm-hmm. In a way that would challenge the agrarian people to think why? And then if you go a little deeper, then you see, now wait a second, soil builds by the successive growth and decay of plants mm-hmm. and animal poop. And so if you're interested in building soil, which is the first sort of necessary condition for healthy plants, you have to plant things. You have to be generous with growth and decay. And so the sower sowing the seeds on, let's say, rocky ground, we always take it my sense is, as Americans, we take it as a snapshot, right? It's once and done. You missed your opportunity, rather than the seasonal, cyclical, classical mind would be thinking, well, you sow with frequency. Mm-hmm. And actually, sometimes, depending on what you're sowing, you sow it multiple times in a season, depending on what you're trying to grow and what your goals are. With wheat, you're not doing it multiple times, but you're at least doing it every year at the appropriate time. And then you see, well, if the plant can't grow and thrive yet, mm-hmm. you grow good soil by the successive growth and decay, growth and death of generations of plants. And so there's a sense in which, and this is the function of a good farmer, is to build soil, to help soil be what it is well, through the growth and decay of organismic life.
Right.
Now, interestingly enough, the modern paradigm from Cartesian and Baconian assumptions it ignores that phenomenon. It's not an organismic enterprise, farming. It's a mechanistic chemical enterprise.
It seems not as historical either. There's something very temporal about the action of the sower and the generation of soil.
Yes.
It is precisely extended in a way that balance sheet accounting seems to push against.
That's right. The abstraction from place, such that we can grow any corn anywhere, mm-hmm. or such that we will not take into account, let's say, how do I say this? The farmer knows their fields by their frequent walking amidst them and on them. It's hard to know your field when from more or less dawn to dusk you're sitting on your butt in an air-conditioned cab,
right,
sowing and then coming in for the harvest. It fosters what would be an exploitative extractionary relation with the land, mm-hmm. where the soil is basically neutral matter from which we take out what we need in plant matter form for whatever we can imagine alchemically to produce.
Right. Well, it's the resource in, resource out.
Yes.
Product out, but it's also alienating for the farmer as the steward of the land.
That's right.
As the person who's acting.
That's right.
So
now this is why in the Midwest and even on the East Coast you have generational degradation of land, such that organic matter levels both on the East Coast have dropped from about 8 to 2% on average, mm-hmm. and in the Midwest have dropped from 3 feet of black soil to some places several inches. That's historically problematic.
Yeah.
loss. The narrative normally ends there, like, look, this sucks, we're screwed, we have to come up with chemical solutions to what are really technologically induced problems. Right?
Or else millions will starve.
Or else millions will starve. Yeah. One of the classes that I now teach, Masanobu Fukuoka and Regenerative Agriculture, lays out a different sort of gaze on the world that actually allows for increased fertility of the soil and increased fertility of the crops. So Fukuoka is a no-till farmer before that was a thing. Mm-hmm. He's also a no-till organic farmer, which is like of grains, of rice particularly, mm-hmm. which is exceedingly rare, and he outproduces all of the best conventional chemical rice farmers in Japan.
Wow.
How does he do it? After 30 years, he's built up soil such that the way that what he calls the sort of way of farming, which he has a book by that title, mm-hmm. is essentially an Aristotelian acting in accordance with like art imitates nature. He's operating on that axiom mm-hmm. without knowing Aristotle.
Yeah,
and so then we sort of come back to as an undergraduate, I was interested in learning the Gospels more, and the philosophy, insofar as grace presupposes and perfects nature, had dovetailed in such a way that I wanted to like get my hands dirty. So I started a little garden and planted tomatoes and broccoli next to each other, which failed miserably because tomatoes and broccoli, which I didn't know, are enemies to each other. They're plant groups excrete exudates that attract the pests of the other plant. So what I learned eventually was it's not just about, like individual substances, right? Mm-hmm. You have to take the farmer has to take into account substances always in relation. And that what modernity has done in abstracting substances from their constitutive relations is of untold damage, both to us and to everything else. We could go in the political realm here, but let's not. The key here is like in the agricultural world, we've done this such that, like, here's a great example. Plants are relatively ineffective at getting all of the nutrients they need because their roots can only reach so far. And so they've worked out synergistic relationships with fungus and bacteria. Mm-hmm. Mycorrhizal fungi is among them. And those fungal networks bring nutrients to the plant by the plant exchanging sugars for whatever it needs, phosphorus, potassium, otherwise slow-moving nutrients. As soon as you spray or till, you've destroyed those fungal networks. We have destroyed the fungal network. We've only recently, in the past 20 years, discovered these mycorrhizal fungal networks, which every other generation sort of operated, let's say, was successful to the degree that they didn't destroy them, and brought about plague to the degree that they did. Mm-hmm. We have held ourselves up, we've buoyed ourselves from plague by dumping chemicals immediately onto the plants, like as in proximately onto the plants, into their root zone to make up for the nutrient deficiency that has arisen from our destruction of the soil. But now we know that like these fungal networks are so much more efficient than we are, but that we've destroyed them so much with our methods that there are people trying to produce nanobots to do what mycorrhizal fungi does and move nutrients through the soil itself mm-hmm. to plants based on whatever our technological apparatus indicates, like this plant needs boron. Oh, send a robot to bring it to it. I wish I were joking, but I've now I'm not. But the fundamental sort of, this begins first with, let's say, like a gaze on what is.
Mm-hmm.
And the classical gaze is even of instructional farming texts. So we can think here, classic instructional farming texts from ancient Greece, or Hesiod's Works and Days, and Virgil's Gorgics. Those classic farming texts are poems.
Mm-hmm.
They have instructions, like when to plow. They even have instructions on like who to marry.
Mm-hmm.
Hesiod has lines about like, his is very detailed. Plowing naked at certain times. It's great. I haven't done that yet. It's on my. Got to figure out when to do that. But right, like the point here would be their instructional advice is subordinate to the poetic form, because they're poems. What that is indicating, it seems to me, is that the poetic gaze is actually the primary gaze of the farmer.
Well, that's fascinating.
Right?
That's interesting.
And that in 10,000 years, people will still read Virgil and Hesiod.
Mm-hmm.
They won't read USDA instruction manuals.
No.
I don't think. Because they're boring, first. Mm-hmm. Second, because they're rife with error.
Mm-hmm.
Third, because they've brought about the denuding of American soils at rates that have hitherto been unimaginable.
Mm-hmm.
And fourth, the practices have brought about, let's say, extraordinary nutrient deficiency in the plant and animal that human societies are contingent on, such that, and there's some research out there that indicates that obesity is actually not first a temperance problem, but first a nutrient deficiency problem.
Right.
That your body is crying out for micronutrients that the food lacks, and so is constantly signaling, you need to eat more because I need more nutrients. But we're eating high-calorie foods. We don't have a calorie deficiency. Right. That is clearly the case. We have a nutrient density deficiency. So, Anyway, all of this is it seems to me, related first to the let's say, the inversion of the poetic gaze to the instructional gaze.
I had not expected to find something like Vico's poetic wisdom in a conversation about farming, which sounds, given its ancient history, still sounds like it is the most practical of professions, the one maybe that's most dependent upon uncontrollables like the weather and the soil and the action of predators or deer, things that want your calorie surplus.
Yes.
But now it sounds like you've almost gone to suggest that there's a kind of cultural and almost mythic regeneration that's needed.
Yes.
In order to heal or correct.
That's right.
What's now 3 centuries old,
yes.
kind of Baconian Cartesian modernity problem.
Yes.
Did that come as a surprise to you in your adventure with farming from your time in grad school up to more recently with the founding of Good Soil Farm?
Yeah, so I think that in graduate school, so what the Mount began in me with its, let's say, both its core philosophy and non-philosophy courses. So the core as a whole, and then the extra philosophy courses I took, and the extra theology courses I took, helped me to see that no one discipline can hope to be the solution to the existential crisis that each generation finds itself in. Right? That each generation, as John Paul II said, each generation has to take up the invitation of the gospel themselves, right? You can't rely on, mom and dad were Christian, and so, you have to take that up in your own freedom, because Christ calls each of us anew, right? In the same way, it seems to me, there's a philosophical call that each generation, I think Fides et Ratio gets at this beautifully, but every single human being is a philosopher. Mm-hmm. They're operating they live their life in answers to great questions. the question isn't whether they're philosophers, it's whether they're doing philosophy well. It's whether they have a rightly ordered philosophy or whether they've thought about that they're philosophers. And it seems to me we tend to fragment and bifurcate and we tend to take disciplinary distinction in a Cartesian separation, right, where the two are fundamentally other, rather than the two are other in terms of like they're abstractions, let's say, within a prior whole that I have to be attentive to, and that is always actually preceding me, and always, let's take this as maybe getting at it. Descartes' project of sort of raising to the ground everything.
Yeah.
Notice that he can't. I mean, you know this, but one of the things I like to point out to students is like he's writing in a language, and he has to. So he can't actually raise everything to the ground.
Correct. Because
language is something that you cannot even think without. Such that he's inheriting, because language is a kind of incarnated cultural, philosophical, theological reality.
Right.
He's inheriting all sorts of things in the very language he uses, right? That we should be attentive to, and that he is trying to divorce himself from, but can't actually, and so is parasitic on. He can only be parasitic in that sense. I think that what's going on now is that the root of regenerative agriculture, I just laid this out in a paper presentation I gave at a talk, is not like, let's say, specific practices like that help with soil building, like agroforestry and contour planting. Those are all good. Those are all necessary. But those all follow from something prior, that regenerative agriculture is actually at its root, which is, I think, the regaining, the I would argue, a kind of conversion, kind of rediscovery of the poetic gaze, a rediscovery of a right human ordination to the cosmos, to creation, such that we can sing with it and not against it. So that even the pest becomes not something that I have to annihilate, but something that communicates something to me.
Yeah.
About what the soil needs, what the plant needs. And actually that shapes my human freedom. I mean, freedom ultimately is not the sort of assertion of myself over and against reality, but obedience to reality. It seems to me, conforming my will to what the thing is, such that it can come to its perfection, its excellence, and that its excellence is already ordered to my own excellence through the human act of eating, and growth and subsequent decay. Right? Like, eventually I too will be soil. Remember, man, that thou art dust. This, I think, the philosophy curriculum at the Mount dovetails well with the core curriculum in this way. It draws out that everything's at stake here. Not just like that I'm not alone and in my own sort of musings, but that my gaze has to be tested with the gaze of others, with the gaze of other creatures, even subhuman creatures. And that the like well-being of all is intimately interconnected.
Yeah, may I ask you a hard question?
Sure.
It seems to me, as something you were saying before about the John Paul II, Fides et Ratio, a text that I know well and teach frequently. I've got to thinking about the question of just how broken is the modern world.
Yeah.
Because I can think back not too many centuries when, without mythologizing too much, I could say that the dominant pattern in human culture is, to follow the ways of your ancestors, is to keep roughly to what, if you're a farmer, you're doing roughly what farmers did prior to you.
Right.
And against this, this is the backdrop against which the rise of the kind of Baconian Cartesian intelligence comes.
Yeah.
With later on its technological mindsets, its imperatives, and whatnot. But looking at this now, almost a quarter of the way through the 21st century, a century that neither you or I will survive.
Yes.
Are we at a place where the old ways are irretrievable?
Yeah.
We're thinking now of say the French intellectuals in the 1830s, right? There's no way of reconnecting with a pre-revolutionary past.
Yeah.
We can revive it. We can bring it back. We could have a restoration of types or reconnection with some sort of depth of reality. But it will never be what it was, and it will never be continuous with what it was, except as it's a genuine engagement with the same reality.
That's right.
that was and is.
Yeah.
That latter prospect makes me feel like we're much more profoundly and irretrievably lost than perhaps we appreciate when we begin the critique.
Yeah.
What do you think to that?
So I think this here is an encounter that I recently had. So I'm now teaching Origins of the West, which is the first culture and civilization course in the core curriculum. On the first day of class, because we're talking about like how cultural practices embody assumptions about reality and about human beings and about human flourishing and about the divinity, etc. As the prayer for that class, I'm having them do the Angelus, and we're not just doing it sitting on our butts, we're doing it like they would have done in pre-modern Christian eras, standing facing the east. So I asked them, where is east? No one knew where east was in that classroom. We were in a classroom that had two of the walls of which were glass. So it's in the new addition on the building. Two of the walls were east. None of them knew where east was in relation to where they are on the campus. And then I said, what happens in the east? So I pointed to them. I showed them where east was. I said, what happens in the east? Only one student said, well, doesn't like the sun do either set or rise in the east?
Oh my word!
And I was, and I thought, okay, this isn't their fault.
Right, no disrespect.
This isn't their fault. They are so divorced from patterns of the cosmos that all previous generations of human beings lived by. And this is exactly why we teach Origins of the West in the core curriculum. To get them to imagine what life would be like. When the sun's rising actually set a pattern for your rising, and the sun's setting actually set a pattern for your setting, where actually most of your life was lived in obedience to realities that were above and beyond your control, that sometimes were frustrating, like the wind. So we use silage tarps. This past about 1.5 years ago, I had the experience of trying to wrestle 100 by 40 foot long and wide piece of silage tarp. And it was super windy. And I thought, it's no wonder that ancients thought that the wind was a god that was against them.
Yeah.
Because every time I get it right, the wind picks back up. And I have been out here for an hour, right? Frustrated. So I think that yes, you're right that so the regenerative agriculture movement is not, let's say, or if it is even a movement, let's say, is not premised on or doesn't require mass death, right? Which is often what's sort of bandied, as in if you were to try and feed the world, we would all die. That's not actually the case, it seems to me. What it would require is the rediscovery of human beings, the rerouting of human beings sense of meaning and identity and happiness in relation to organismic realities, so like creatures, not of our making, that give rise to contemplative opportunities that would then help them be happier, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's and that are scalable with relative ease, right? By that I mean, like, if you have access to a community garden or a backyard,
Yeah.
you can engage in regenerative agriculture on some level. You're not doing it as a business, but you're still engaging in the gaze that, or you could do it in a way that you engage in the gaze of regenerative agriculture. You could do it in a technocratic paradigm, conventional chemical system. In either case, you're embedding yourself in a way of being that, let's say, either that can challenge oneself and one's assumptions, or let's say, like, embed oneself more deeply in one's assumptions. I mean, regenerative agriculture, the fun thing about it is that you're always challenged by your assumptions about the animals and plants that you work with. Like, you think you know them, and then they surprise you. You're like, crap.
Yeah.
I thought I had this one down, but this season, something's not right, and I've got to now figure out, like, what it is.
Goats turn out to be smarter than you expected.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes. So these are the kind of things that I think that rather than looking at it as I think that regenerative agriculture is critiqued often as being nostalgic, in the same way that philosophy as a discipline can be, like, seen as esoteric and old and unnecessary. My sense is that actually both are more deeply perennial, because they are what give rise to a life where you don't want to shoot yourself. Right?
That's a good modern point.
Right. So, like, in the most hopeless generation that has ever existed, arguably, is now. I mean, maybe like pagan Rome, where the gravestone said how quickly we sink from nothing to nothing. Like, maybe that matched us. I'm not sure, though, because I teach undergraduates who are very much sad and hopeless, often. Philosophy becomes for them a source of great hope, a source that being is good. Like, this is why Plato is so wonderful.
Right.
Like, here's rational justification for being is good.
Yeah.
Despite all of the crap.
Meaning, of course, also you are good insofar as you exist. And a friend of mine had said years ago that that's his thought about the modern versus the pre-modern world, is that the modern world had lost the ability to say to anything that exists, including you. Yes, right. you suffering, you. Yes, it's good that you exist.
That's right.
I can affirm that, with no irony and no interest.
That's right.
What you were describing before sounded to me like a kind of spiritual and even philosophical therapy.
Yes.
Regenerative agriculture is therapeutic. Philosophy, in a sense, as deeply therapeutic for the modern condition.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I think some indications of that from, let's say, the conventional world are horse therapy, right? So we know that human beings with deep-seated emotional problems, and we'll just leave it at that. Deep-seated emotional problems and or developmental problems find enormous gains, both emotionally and developmentally, by working with horses. Now, to a modern, that came as a surprise. Like, wow, weird.
Yeah.
To anyone from the classical world, they would have been like, duh.
Yeah.
Humans have been working with horses for thousands of years. In fact, the human-horse tie is to the benefit of both parties. Like, horses are happier when worked. The whole idea of like a horse rescue farm where you abandon horses to meander in fields that are overgrazed is so depressing to the horses.
Yeah.
Let alone to the human beings that are there, trying to scrabble together a living, having unridden horses that they then just let die.
Now, there's an interesting romantic counterpart to the modern sort of technocratic mind.
That's right.
Is that if there's a certain kind of use that is use in harmony with the things
That's
being,
right.
which seems to be off limits or at least ignored.
Yes.
By the modern mindset.
Yes.
So if we're not exploiting it as a resource, we ought to sort of leave it in its sort of Edenic.
That's right.
Pristineness.
Exactly. Think about this whole climate change push that many are making is the only solutions offered. The dominant solutions offered are solar panels and windmills. So much so that Norway's just legalized the deep sea mining, which is exceedingly dangerous. I just found out yesterday that carbon is sequestered in large quantities at the bottom of the ocean. So now we're going to go digging around there. It's going to be great. Like, we're asking for more problems.
Oh dear.
But what no one has suggested, except for me and like a friend of mine here at the Mount, is that we bring back horses. Not for nostalgia's sake. Like, I'm not saying we get rid of cars.
Yeah.
For long trips, we need a car. But maybe for short trips to the Jubilee, the local grocery store, maybe in the city, where you're really just going about 3 miles if you live in the city.
Yeah.
Maybe you just need a horse. Yeah. And then you'd have all the economic gains that come from that. Blacksmiths, liveries, horse trainers. Like, you'd have actual industries arise from regaining our organismic relationships rather than the sort of siloing that occurs when you sit in your car isolated alone, right? And you're just frustrated and angry that there are so many people. Yeah. Or that you're not even angry that there are so many people. You're angry that there are so many cars. Yeah. Because we isolate the person. We abstract the person out of it as if that car cut me off.
Yeah.
Interesting. I think you're right. I think part of we don't see the economic gains because we necessarily think that usefulness is exploitative, and therefore the only other alternative is to not exploit it and to just let it be. Well, actually, you can let it be and work with it so that its being and your using are actually mutually harmonious. Like, this is the history of domestication. Regaining that is not a loss or a sort of play, a return to nostalgia. It's actually, let's say, like entering. It's actually like what is necessary for right living as humans who are creatures. It's necessary for, let's say, the future success of the cosmos, it seems to me. And that's not just like my theory, but I think it plays out because we can't, at our current rate, we overproduce food.
Yeah.
We overproduce certain kinds of food. Our overproduction of food corresponds with an fattening of human beings and livestock. And the over-extraction, over-use of the soil, so the over-chemicalization of the land, which then leads to other detriments for the humans, such that cancer rates are at their highest ever, and all this sort of stuff. Yeah. And I think, as one who's had cancer, I'm not really interested in having it again, and I'd like my children to minimize the things that can expose them to it. I think philosophy plays a role here. I think philosophy plays a role because it requires you to recognize that whatever you think you know, whatever system you think you have, is not adequate to the wisdom that you're actually in love with. And so you have to transcend. Your conceptions of wisdom are always inadequate to the ineffable wisdom that you're seeking, that you're actually in love with. I think the analogy I use with my students is this, right? We've all seen the married couple happily holding hands 70 years after marriage. And everyone's heart melts at them when you see them in the grocery store or at a restaurant. We've all also seen the, let's say 30 to 40 year married couple who's at the dinner and they're both on their smartphones. And everyone's heart cringes, right? Because their relationship is sad. Why? My sense is because they have thought of each other not as we think of wisdom, right? Not as something infinitely mysterious, that there's always more to know.
Yeah.
And so always more to love. And so love is always deepening. But rather as a kind of, Nancy Drew novel, right? Oh, well, I know you, I've known you for 30 years. There's nothing behind the curtain anymore. You're boring.
Yeah.
And the phone is more exciting because it has a false limitlessness, right? A kind of two-dimensional infinitude.
The infinite cave.
The infinite cave, where wisdom, to which we have to be attentive, makes us sort of, let's say, wisdom calls us, right, first, into a relationship. By giving us a desire for her in the first place, she calls us into the relationship. And she coaxes us and consoles us, and then has us in desolation, and then consoles us some more. And there's this, if you will, to go Plato's allegory of the cave, right? There's this dragging of us, and our rejoicing in that being dragged, and our being pained by it at the same time. In the same way that it seems to me, the soil is like that. As in, we thought 40 years ago that we understood soil. We don't.
Yeah.
We don't. And instead of thinking that we can exhaustively understand soil, perhaps we should have some humility, right? Which is related to humus, which is related to soil in the first place. Some humility, and recognize that perhaps there are both substances and relations here that rather than trying to understand in the mode of mastery, I should understand in the mode of partnership, in the mode of marriage, where I'm working with them knowing that I know enough, just enough, to know how to work with them.
Right.
But that I'm always learning more. And that brings great joy, rather than a kind of tyrannical, let's say, despotic pleasure. It brings the deep joy of, let's say, indissoluble union, infleshed in my own body.
Right.
It seems to me philosophy has much to offer the world, and much to offer each person in calling them on this journey, on this adventure, on this, let's say, vocation to love. Yeah.
That's brilliant. That's beautifully said, and it seems appropriate. Both you and I, as both men have been married for quite a long time, with children.
Yeah.
Thinking now about the mystery of marriage.
Yes.
And one of these things that also seems to be in a kind of crisis, especially in the minds of younger generation.
Yeah.
So, let me ask you a question that I do generally ask at the end of each episode. Now, you're the first person I've interviewed who actually does sort of, for pay, teach philosophy to undergraduates, the same population that I teach.
Right.
What kind of advice might you offer to someone who's curious about philosophy, but also knows the sort of cultural buzz, and doesn't, I especially think, doesn't want to have to go home at Thanksgiving and have that conversation with their parents at which they say, I've decided to major in philosophy, or even the minor in philosophy.
Yes.
What types of experiences or conversations or advice would you give to this? It's called in the philosophy curious.
Yes. So I always recommend that students who catch, as it were, like I think that the discipline of philosophy, those who, let's say, who hand over their life to the kind of critical inquiry that the discipline calls for, I do think that that's a kind of calling from wisdom. Mm-hmm. And I recognize, and why. I think it's a calling from wisdom for the sake of the rest of, I think it's essentially service-oriented. And by that I mean it's a calling from wisdom for the sake of the common good. Which requires the common good. So I'm going to steal from Pieper here, but like human beings, as Pieper knows, like can't live out in the open. Right? Mm-hmm. We can't live in the realm of contemplation. We have common needs. We have real, legitimate needs. And so the beauty of studying philosophy at the Mount, and the beauty of the Mount's core curriculum, is that it recognizes both the primacy of the common good and the subordinated common need in relation to that common good. Like, what will make you happy? Not the common need. The common good will make you happy. But you also need to, like, be a human being well. And that requires external goods and goods of the body and goods of the soul.
Right.
And so I always recommend to would-be philosophy majors that they double major. Mm-hmm. That they take another major in addition to philosophy that has, let's say, that their parents will be pleased with, right? That won't get them the sort of the Thanksgiving dunce hat, right? Of you were stupid to have majored in philosophy. What were you thinking? But I say to them that you're majoring in philosophy. You're going beyond the core curriculum requirements. Will not undermine your success in whatever concrete task you undertake. Mm-hmm. Will actually make you more capable of critically engaging in that task and thinking about that task's relation to what matters most. In other words, to order their lives in such a way that they don't become the sad millionaire by 30 who kills themselves, but rather that they recognize that what are the goods I'm pursuing, mm-hmm. and what is the hierarchy of those goods, such that I don't seek to find my happiness in my econ major, mm-hmm. though that contributes to my happiness as a farmer in profound ways. But spreadsheets can only make one so happy, even when they're really elegant. Happiness arises, in the deepest sense, from something greater that requires greater reflection, greater contemplation, and a greater attentiveness, a sort of a stance of like philosophy. What it does first is teach you that the fundamental stance of the human being vis-a-vis the world is one of receptive openness and wonder. Mm-hmm. If your discipline crushes that wonder, then you should be able to reflect on that so that you can challenge your discipline. And so I want, if my student's a sociology major who wants to double major in philosophy, or wants to be a philosophy major, then I will also ask them, well, what what practical skills are you good at, such that like you can also do something else. That seems to me to help students get out of the mode of thinking of philosophy as a job, and thinking about philosophy as a way of life that you can also get paid for, but that's not your primary goal. If it were, I wouldn't be here, because I'm not getting paid very much. So, like, philosophy is not first how to make bank.
Right.
Philosophy is how to love wisdom, being, the good, the true, the beautiful. How do I critically engage in reflections that allow me to love better? And in that sense, I think philosophy is suited to any discipline, which is why in classical curriculum it was required for everyone, and still is at places like the core, because we think that everyone needs to be, let's say, formed.
Yeah, formation, just the model I'm thinking of. The invitation here is to think of education in its multiple, I want to say, registers in which it operates.
Yeah.
Some places as preparation, some places as skill building, and other places as sort of deep, profound self-formation.
Yes.
And in my own classes, I speak of self-ownership.
Yes.
Or
Yes.
self-possession. Since you can't give away what you don't have. If you wish to give yourself to the church, to a spouse, to the human race in service, you have to have yourself first.
Yes,
and
right.
That's philosophy. It's one of the paths to ensuring that you can do that.
Yeah. And I think, I love the allegory of the cave. The moment, one of the things I really make them think about, Plato calls the prisoner the freed prisoner. My students always want to say the prisoner who frees himself. And I say that is the American self-sufficiency coming out. No. The prisoner is freed. Why? Because we're dependent, to totally co-opt McIntyre's book title, we're dependent rational animals. We depend on others, and that we find our happiness in relation to God, in relation to others, in right relation with myself, understanding myself in relation to others, and in relation to the rest of the cosmos, at whose death I live. By whose death my children are fattened, right? There's a great Johnny Cash song, I'll get 'em fat come picking time, right? It's a beautiful song. My children live by the death of the things that I raise. That is memento mori taken all the way down, right? Remember your death, not just because, remember death, and not just your death, but that death is necessary for, let's say, conversion. I would take Plato's allegory of the cave, right? He frees them, the unnamed person who comes from above, frees them, and then forces them to look where they don't want to look, and then drags them out of the cave. The Greek word there is interest. I think it's very interesting because it's related. It's the same Greek word that John uses in his gospel for Christ when Christ says, "And I, when I'm lifted up, will draw all nations to myself."
Is that right?
It is.
I did not know that.
Fascinating. I think there's a paper to be written there. I don't know that I have the time or skills to do it, but I think that what's going on there is this being drawn is this kind of being dragged in some way against my will to that which I deeply know is good for me, and that I will rejoice on when I see it. That's the core curriculum. That's philosophy that which then spills into, once they see it, they want to become majors. And you have to help them see, yes, but your major is not for yourself. Again, this is allegory of the cave, right?
Yeah.
Your major is not for yourself to go navel gaze on the good alone on the mountain, Zarathustra-esque. Right. But your vocation is in some way to live this out in the concrete patterns of your life when you're an adult, when you get out of college. I mean, you're already adults, but when you go into some other field for the sake of the common good and the common need, to rightly order those things.
So even your philosophical wisdom is not ultimately for you.
That's right.
It's relational as well.
That's right.
It's also it's service everywhere.
That's right.
Service all the way down.
Yeah. Which ultimately is sort of, well, again, I'll steal Pieper here, paradigmatically consummated in worship. Mm-hmm. It ends, and even for the Greeks, right?
Right.
Like, this is why Plato's setting is important. It's an Athenian religious festival.
Right.
Right. It's that we can't abstract that out and just be like, oh no, they're at the bar talking philosophy. No.
Coming home from worship.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's right.
And interestingly, Cephalus he ditches the argument to go make sacrifice.
That's right. He leaves the conversation to go tend to his religious duty. I forgot that. That's true. Yeah.
And I think this also makes sense of Socrates' last words in the Phaedo. Mm-hmm. Right? We owe a cock to Asclepius.
Right.
Which is an essentially liturgical action.
Yeah.
It's a religious sacrifice.
Yep.
So that ultimately, this is where the distinction between philosophy, theology, between faith and reason, is not a separation. It's much more akin to the grace presupposing and perfecting nature as nature. Mm-hmm. It's the consummation. It's perfection. All of my desires about wisdom have now been satisfied in the one who is wisdom incarnate.
Right.
Yeah.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Stephen. I knew this would be a fantastic conversation. It's gone on much longer than I anticipated, and I'm really grateful for you making so much time for me.
Well, thank you. It was
and
fun.
for us today.
Yeah.
My guest today has been my friend and philosophy colleague, Professor Stephen McGinley, philosopher, farmer, father, and I have to say this, people already know if they've listened, the man I know who has thought most deeply and most profoundly about the nature of farming and of what it means to, in the modern period, be someone who raises, who purchases, who consumes food. So I always learn a tremendous amount from our conversations. I really appreciate you giving me a chance to record this one for the podcast. Thanks so much.
My pleasure. Thank you, Chris.
Bye-bye.
See ya.
Thank you for listening to Life After Philosophy. If you enjoyed the podcast, please rate it 5 stars and share this episode with a friend. I appreciate your support.